All right, so I'm going to do two things in this lecture. I'm going to first provide a brief history of the New York City mass transit system, and I'm also going to embed that concept within Elinor Ostrom's collective action theory. Elinor Ostrom was one of the more important political economists of the second half of the 20th century, awarded the Nobel Prize in economics in the early 2000s. Her ideas have gone on to influence environmental economics, urban economics, and economics writ large. What I'll do in this video is I will make the argument that the New York City mass transit system, both its creation and its development, are akin to what Ostrom would call a collective action problem and a collective action solution. So let's get started. The economics of public transportation are pretty straightforward. There are several reasons for which having a central authority provide public transportation makes not only social sense, but in fact makes economic sense. You have the public goods free rider problem, in which, since everyone would benefit from a mass transit system, but without public funding of that transit system, you would have people taking advantage while not paying into it. There is a free rider problem. So it's much easier for us to fund a transportation system through something like taxes, and this allows us to keep fares low and maintain access to the public transportation system for the entire city as opposed to only certain parts. Transportation, especially in the 20th century and 21st centuries with the advent of the personal automobile, comes with it an extremely high burden with respect to negative externalities, most specifically pollution, as well as road congestion, which requires not only increased maintenance on roads, but just generally is bad for human psychology. One discussion that we've had in class is about the topic of polarization. And one thing with public transportation is that it can alleviate polarization. If there are communities within a particular economic region that are not a part of the broader economic region or are cut out for one reason or another or have over time become polarized, the linkage of that particular area with the broader public transportation system may in fact end that detrimental polarization. And it's also the case that public transportation takes advantage of what we would call scale economies. In this sense, as systems grow larger, they in fact can grow more efficient. And within the US, the public transportation systems are often fairly small compared to the broader city, which explains at least one reason why public transportation systems are less popular in the US than they are in other parts of the world, where they're larger and make up larger components of people's transportation plans. Not only are there economic arguments for public transportation, but there are, of course, straightforward pragmatic arguments as well. Within New York City, a public transportation system would allow us to move not only within boroughs, but across them. This would give the citizens both within and across those boroughs greater economic and social freedom. This incentivizes social harmony in the sense that we all have now a shared space in which we occupy at the same time, as opposed to individual cars or individual modes of transportation. Public transportation systems naturally bring individuals together. And as we previously mentioned with our scale economy arguments, there are clear efficiency gains. If you think about personal automobiles as a form of transportation, and you think about how many cars you would need to transport 100 people by way of cars, that takes up a lot more space than if you were to take those 100 people and move them by bus or by train. And so there are clear efficiency arguments to public transportation. In 1965, Mancure-Olson suggested that collective action would largely fall to be unsuccessful. And the reason he put that it would be unsuccessful is that in large groups, individual preferences will rule out any ability of that large group to come together over some central or common interest. So his suggesting was that in small groups, you can come together over central issues and central needs, and you could form collective action. However, as the size of the group grew and as the number of diverse preferences and diverse voices were in that particular group, the harder it would be to form collective action because you would be adding individual self-interested preferences. This sort of argument falls in line with a fairly neoclassical, neoliberal view of economics, in which rational self-interest is the basis of both economic models as well as what informs our policy proposals. Elinor Ostrom comes along later and argues that, in fact, if the problem is big enough and or the gains of the solution are large enough, that in fact it is fairly rational for people to see that their self-interest requires a collective action. In other words, in Olson's perspective, it was in fact the self-interest that would lead us to grow apart and not form collective action. Whereas Ostrom said that in fact it would be the realization from a self-interested perspective that we needed to come together to solve some problem. However, the ability of us to do this requires two things. First, people have to recognize that there is an issue, and there has to be some relative consensus, not only about the issue, but about the potential solutions. And so what Elinor Ostrom describes is not a solution to a collective action problem, but perhaps a potential roadwork of a potential solution. And Elinor Ostrom argued that there were three core components to the success of collective action. Reputation, that is, that the individuals who are leading the collective action should be well regarded and should be well understood, that those individuals were trusted to carry out the broader interests of the group, and that any collective action involved reciprocity amongst individuals. Olson would argue that Ostrom's view was perhaps anti-economic. And what I mean by anti-economic is that it perhaps falls outside of the purview of mutual transactions driving economic decision making. But in fact, I believe Elinor Ostrom would argue that the last word there, reciprocity, creates the need for mutual benefits. So it isn't the case that the search of mutual benefits would require us to move beyond collective action, but rather that it would be collective action that would show us the need for mutual benefits and the need for reciprocity. So in some sense, what Ostrom is arguing is that instead of problems growing out of individual preferences, there could in fact be some social preference, some social collective acknowledgement of a problem that would then drive self-interest towards the collective solution. In the construction of the New York City mass transit system, there were a number of potential barriers. One was that any creation of an existing or augmentation of an existing transit system could exacerbate and not assist in existing segregation. New York City has, since its inception, been a city that's heavily segregated, and any transit system that would seek to reduce that segregation may fail. It is in fact the case that mass transit systems or a lack of mass transit systems can create the very polarization that they are trying to get away from. This is an issue of any sort of opportunity that would bring particular behavior to a particular location, as we've talked about with agglomeration. As businesses seek efficiency gains through agglomeration, this may lead to natural polarization of given areas. Building public infrastructure is very expensive. It takes a long time. There's a lot of headaches involved. And as a result, the development of a broad enough public transportation system to help a broad enough number of people could in fact be cost prohibitive, or at least be viewed such from societal's perspective. People are always wary about spending the public dollar, and for good reason, but this could in fact be a barrier to the development of an actually efficient mass transit system. And of course, and New York City is no stranger to this issue, there is the problem of corruption. With these sorts of public enterprises like mass transit, usually these involved a lot of what we call public-private partnerships. And of course, we'll detail one of the most important public-private partnerships of all time here in just a few moments. But anytime you have these public-private partnerships, what you have is the potential for public corruption. And, you know, it is as true to the nature of humans as corruption is true to the nature of politics. In New York City, though, the mass transit system has proven itself be the economic battery. Mass transit has both explicit and direct economic benefits. It's socially and culturally transformative. It allows individuals to retain some sense of social or cultural significance by continuing to remain in their communities, but having the ability to travel outside of them if they so desire. Transit can be inclusive. It can depolarize not only economic systems, but social systems, and can bring us together. However, when you design a mass transit system, you inevitably be required to leave certain parts of a city behind, because we know that when you lay tracks down or when you add a bus line, you're going to attract economic development. And if you're attracting economic development to one area, but you don't have a bus line or a train going to another area, it's very well possible that that particular area will not economically develop. And so mass transit systems actually become one of the main creators of that uneven economic development that we've been talking about so much in class. Okay, so let's go through a brief history of the New York City transit system. The first transit in New York City was, of course, by boat. The Fulton Ferry, which started service in 1817, was the first method of transportation that took people from Brooklyn and into Manhattan. Prior to this, the only way in which you were able to get from Brooklyn to Manhattan was by small personal boat or by small taxi boat, for which there were not actually that many companies. So the Fulton Ferry was the first large-scale transit between Brooklyn and New York City, and arguably New York City's first mass transit system. Shortly after the creation of the Fulton Ferry, what you had was a large influx of labor supply into lower and mid Manhattan. And as this labor supply flew into lower and mid Manhattan, what you had was a need for additional transportation. A. Brower in 1827 creates the first operating stagecoach business. He operated what he called his omnibuses, and these were the first transit. He operated his omnibuses, and these were the first source of so-called multi-person transportation within lower and mid Manhattan. In 1833, New York City, through cooperation with private companies, begins allowing the laying down of metal tracks, which at that point were still pulling horse-drawn stagecoaches. But as you can see in the picture, the size of the stagecoach began to grow. And with the establishment of the rails, it organized the stagecoach into their own section of the roads, which enabled the roads to continue to be used by other horse-drawn carriages and such. By 1855, there are over more than 500 transit cars in Manhattan and Brooklyn. There are more By 1855, there are more than 10 omnibus and stagecoach companies, and they operate more than 500 transit cars just in Manhattan and Brooklyn. At this point, there's virtually no transportation out into East New York or Queens or even the Bronx, and for even large parts of Upper Manhattan in Harlem and beyond, you still lack any sense of a transportation system. But in downtown Brooklyn, Brooklyn Heights area of Brooklyn, as well as in lower and mid Manhattan, what you're starting to see now is a real ease of transportation. Beginning in 1870, you see the first construction of elevated rail in New York City. And in 1878, you have what is the first commuter rail. There were existing rail lines in New York City, but prior to the opening of the Brighton line, which was the first to connect downtown Brooklyn to Coney Island, and to this day still remains a subway line, you did not have commuter rail lines. So the lines were primarily for commercial ends or for city ends. These were the first commuter lines. In 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge is constructed. This becomes the first physical connection between Manhattan and Brooklyn. And shortly thereafter, you have the implementation of not only railway in the form of business rail, but you also have the creation of several trolley systems which allow for commuters to now go, for the first time ever, from Midtown Manhattan all the way out to Coney Island. Now, in 1883, what this required was for you to take a stagecoach, because they were still stagecoaches back then, from Midtown Manhattan to around City Hall. And then at City Hall, you would get on a trolley here at the Brooklyn Bridge. You would then take this across the Brooklyn Bridge to Brooklyn Heights. You would then exit. You would get on another stagecoach. You would then be taken over to the Brighton line, which we saw prior. You would get on a train at the Brighton line, and then you could take that to Coney Island. So while it was possible to go from Midtown Manhattan to Coney Island, it was still pretty arduous. Then the creation of the Fulton Elevated Line is the first to create service out to East New York and Queens. This is incredibly important because for the first time, you actually saw the mass transit system grow the city. Up to this point, the mass transit system had really only concentrated in the already existing busy parts of the city. Now what you have is a transit system that, in fact, takes people away from the busy parts of the city and into the more residential parts of the city. The need for a underground mass transit system came in 1888 with the so-called Great Blizzard. The Great Blizzard taught New York City that if the above ground rail that you depend upon is taken offline, it can completely shut down the city, which is what happened. Not only were you not able to use the existing rail lines, either for commuting or for commercial interests, but in fact, they had to use the rail lines to take snow out of the city. And if you can imagine, what they were doing is they were loading up these trains with snow, taking them out to the harbor and dumping them into the harbor, which I think sounds pretty wild. One of the more important components of even the more modern mass transit system occurs in 1892 when the Fifth Avenue Elevated Line, which is in the western part of Brooklyn in Sunset Park and Bay Ridge, now connects all the way out to Bay Ridge and Gravesend, Brooklyn, which is in really the extreme southwest portion of Brooklyn, now is connected with Manhattan. And what this means is that you don't even now have to make any transfers. You're able to get on a train in Midtown Manhattan. You can then transfer to another train at City Hall. From City Hall all the way out to Bay Ridge, you can now take a single train. There's also the 39th Street Ferry, which was a boat in Sunset Park. You could now take a train to 39th Street in Sunset Park and then take the ferry into Manhattan, or come from Manhattan back out to the 39th Street Ferry and get on a train that way. In 1898, New York City becomes the 5 consolidated boroughs. I think this is perhaps the first step in Eleanor Ostrom's collective action. What you have is the different boroughs which had amassed their own political power in their own way. And I think this picture is fairly indicative of it. You have the 5 borough presidents who are sort of their own rabble-rousing political interests. But they sort of put down their own individual interests and realize that, in fact, coming together as a collective 5-borough city has many economic as well as political benefits. In the early 1900s, you have a massive expansion of trolley service. It's important to remember that at this point, they're still private companies. There is no public rail service in the city at all. The city would contract with these companies to lay tracks down and to have right-of-way allowed, but these were still operated by private companies. Here's one of the earliest transit maps. This is specifically for Brooklyn. The red lines are the rail service and the horse-drawn service as well. And so this is the early part of the 1900s. You still have the use of horses in many parts of the city, but horses are slowly being taken offline, as what you have now is electric rail. So in this part of the early 1900s, what you have is the elevated lines are electric. You even have some of the trolley lines, which of course they're electric as well. And so you have a mechanization of the public transportation system in Brooklyn. And then in 1904, we have New York City's first official subway line, which was opened by the Interborough Rapid Transit Corporation. This operates from City Hall all the way up to 145th Street. So if you can imagine, the first official subway line was actually really long and went all the way from the financial district in lower Manhattan and all the way up past into Harlem. This was obviously a milestone in New York City and suggested many things to come. So far, we have not had any rail service that connects Manhattan and Brooklyn that doesn't go over bridges, but the bridges are getting really congested. By this time, we, of course, have the Brooklyn Bridge, but it's getting really busy. And so, what New York City realizes is that we need to be able to connect Manhattan and Brooklyn underground and through subways. So, what you have is the first tunnels, which now connect Manhattan to Brooklyn. The Joralemon Street Tunnel was the first tunnel to connect Manhattan to Brooklyn, and the Joralemon Street Tunnel is still used today. In fact, if you take a 405 train from Brooklyn into Lower Manhattan, you go through this very same tunnel. With the construction of the Manhattan and Williamsburg bridges in 1912 and 1903, respectively, what you have is an alleviation of at least some of the congestion on the Brooklyn Bridge. However, what the construction of these two bridges highlighted more than anything else was the need for more underground transportation, as these bridges quickly, as bridges tend to do, become just as concentrated and congested as the Brooklyn Bridge. And another huge milestone, you have the city, the consolidated New York City, create with the two subway system companies, the Interborough Rapid Transit, IRT, and the Brooklyn Rapid Transit, to agree on what we call the dual contracts. And the way the dual contracts worked was the city saw the need for subways, but the city didn't want to operate the subways. And there were these existing subway companies. But the subway companies were reticent to build tunnels because tunnels were extremely expensive, as well as there was a need to get city approval for any tunnel that you happen to build. So what the city and the transit companies decided to do was to come up with the dual contracts, which gave the city the power to decide where and when they dug the tunnels, but then the city gave the service of the transit lines to the private companies. So the city would dig the tunnels, and then the companies would operate the lines. And then you have the first dedicated commuter subway line out to Brooklyn, which opens along Fifth Avenue. And if you take the R train today, not only does your train go along the exact same tracks of this initial commuter route, but in fact, the picture you're seeing now, the 77th Street station in Bay Ridge, is the precise location of the 77th Street station today. So not only are you riding a subway, which has the exact same lines as was built in 1916, you are also taking the same station. The creation of the Fourth Avenue subway line is further evidence of Eleanor Ostrom's collective action, because it was in fact civic engagement. Specifically, it was the Brooklyn interborough politicians and the communities of Bay Ridge, Gravesend, Sunset Park, and other parts of Southwest Brooklyn who demanded greater access to the economic benefits of downtown Brooklyn and lower Manhattan. And they clamored and fought and won as the city agreed to build the subway line. And so, again, Eleanor Ostrom argued that if the problem is big enough and if the benefits are large enough, then you will see collective action. And in the creation of the Fourth Avenue subway line, I think we get some confirmation of that. I love this newspaper article because can you imagine 5,000 people showing up today for any meeting? In this picture, this is the celebration of the opening of the Fourth Avenue subway line. The celebration included the dressing up of individuals in pilgrim and pioneer costumes. And I think this is interesting because it goes to show you the way in which people thought about public transportation systems back then, and that they were pioneering, and that this was akin to coming over on the Mayflower into what would become America. Of course, as is with most things, you start to have problems. So the IRT was notorious for providing not only poor and slow service, but also having especially gruff workers. This was also true of the BRT. Another problem you have is the elevated train lines were built in such a way to the extent that they would often rub right up against the tenement buildings. So if you were a low income individual, not only did you have to live near train tracks, which were loud and reduced property values, but sometimes they would go up to your bedroom window. Here's the original map for the Fourth Avenue subway line. And if you look closely and you go out to Bay Ridge, you'll see that most of the stops are identical to the stops as they are today. So one of the interesting things is that when you look at the creation of the New York City subway system, is that it hasn't changed. That is that the Fourth Avenue subway line, which was built in before 1920, has virtually the same stops and has virtually all the same rail that it did back then. Now, this is both a feat of engineering as well as a problem because the needs of 2020 are much different than the needs of 1917. And because subway lines are so disruptive, they require tunneling, they require ease of access, zoning rules. It's very hard to build them. And therefore, however you built them 100 years ago, that's going to largely dictate the outcomes you experience today. So one of the biggest problems with the transportation system is that it was built 100 years ago and does not necessarily reflect the needs of the city today. A defining moment in the New York City's mass transit history is the Great Malbone Street Wreck in 1918. In 1918, you have a large driver strike at the BRT, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit, who notoriously paid their employees very little money. And so their employees went on strike. And as a result, the BRT had a shortage of qualified drivers. And so they stuck a driver on who had not ever really driven a train before. And as a result, what you had was what remains today to be America's largest transit wreck. Um, and today remains the largest wreck with respect to the number of dead. What the Malbone Street wreck told the city was that we need to pay more attention to this, that the problems brewing in the mass transit system were starting to become too large to ignore. And if you have a large event like the wreck, then it draws attention to that particular issue. Again, it is the collective action component recognizing that there's a problem. Now, in a perfect world, it wouldn't take um, dozens of people to die in a mass transit wreck for us to recognize it, but sometimes that's the way it works, unfortunately. In 1919, Brooklyn Rapid Transit files for bankruptcy, in part because of the Malbone Street wreck and the payments they had to make afterwards. The BRT was only a business for about 30 years. In that time, however, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company did operate a large scale rapid transit system. And so, despite the fact that the company was never very profitable and ultimately went bankrupt, it really set the stage for what would come after. As the combustion engine becomes the primary use of transportation in America, you see the replacing of electric trolleys with buses, which is interesting in the sense that it may in fact represent a reduction in overall efficiency because the trolleys were typically larger than the buses. However, now the buses could, of course, uh, ride on surface roads, did not require metal tracks, did not require inconvenient electrical hookups, and so there was a trade off. They were smaller, but they could get around more. In 1940, you have the creation of what would eventually become the MTA. So we have the consolidation of the BMT, which was formerly the BRT, and the IRT. And with the consolidation, the two companies were in fact essentially given to the city. I love this picture because you can tell that the person who is giving the transit system to the mayor definitely is happy to be doing so, and the mayor is happy to take it, which I think says something about the way politics work. That the guy who's giving the transit system to the mayor knows something the mayor doesn't know, and that is that running a transportation system is very, very difficult. In 1945, the Robert Moses era shifts the city's priorities away from mass transit. Robert Moses preferred to build infrastructure that was primarily focused on individual cars, like, for example, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, which cut its way through the city in a way that fundamentally changed the city's future. Not only did the creation of the Brooklyn Queens Expressway cut up that particular part of the city and lead to social and cultural upheaval in downtown Brooklyn, but it also greatly created new agglomeration opportunities for businesses. And here in this picture, you can just imagine that prior to the creation of the BQE, as you see here pictured, that everywhere where you see the BQE, that those used to be residential and commercial areas. So just the actual physical creation of the BQE had tremendous, massive effects. And then what you have is a rather slowdown in activity. From basically the 1930s all the way through until the 1980s, very little is done to the New York City mass transit system. And much of the system actually starts to become and fall into disrepair. By the way, this also includes the Brooklyn Bridge, which in the 1980s actually saw one of its major cables snap. And it was left that way for almost a year before it was fixed. Not many people know that today. The more modern New York subway, of course, attempts to be efficient, but often fails, in part because if you just look at the way in which the system is laid out, it's almost fairly clear that the system is convoluted, in that it was a system that was built in a piecemeal fashion, and then it was built over time. So it's full of all these extensions and all of these, things that I think, looking back in hindsight, don't make a whole lot of sense, and that if you could redesign the subway system, people would do it in a much different way. And then recently, in the last few years, what you've had is a sort of notion that there needs to be a massive reinvestment. So here the MTA unveiled a $51.5 billion plan in 2018. I can guarantee you that ultimately, if there ever is a big plan to seriously overhaul the MTA, it's going to be much more than $51.5 billion. In fact, I would argue that if you looked at actually modernizing the New York City mass transit system and actually, I think, taking it to its full potential, you're talking at least $1 trillion investment, if not more, which, that's problematic. And has really always been one of the problems of the mass transit system, is that, again, going back, they're very expensive. And, with the city having the financial difficulties that it had in the 1970s, this put the city on edge. The other thing that happened in the 1970s is New York City had, massive financial problems, and basically decision making with the MTA was moved to Albany, to the state government. So in fact, New York City only has a partial say in the operations of the MTA, and much of the MTA is in fact, regulated by the state government and not necessarily the city government. That also presents a number of problems. Okay, so in this video, I hope you enjoyed a brief history of the mass transit system. You could spend hours upon hours more learning about all the different interesting facets. But what I hope you notice here is that the mass transit system is a collective action response to a problem. And that problem is that there are economic inefficiencies of lacking a mass transit system. And the creation of a mass transit system is a collective action response to what is a large scale social problem. And in my mind, this not only backs up Eleanor Ostrom's notion of the collective action, but in many respects speaks to both the success of collective action as well as the current problems of collective action. So if you go back to those three core components of collective action, and that last one being reciprocity, I think there's still a sense in New York City's mass transit system there's a lack of reciprocity. And sometimes the MTA feels it, sometimes the city feels it, and certainly sometimes the citizens feel it. So Eleanor Ostrom's collective action wasn't a solution to a problem, but it was an argument that the solution would be found only through collective action.